Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Theresa Sheppard Alexander. She's an author and a therapist. And this is the book that I've just read, Facing the Wolf Inside the Process of Deep Feeling Therapy. Theresa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
It's a delight. And we have a lot in common. So we have both discovered Primal Therapy initially, and you've gone on to extend that and create something you describe as deep feeling therapy, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I wonder if, for context here, we begin, and actually where your book begins, with what led you up to initially discovering this thing called Primal Therapy.
Well, I will say that from a very young age, when I was 10 years old, I discovered the word psychiatrist. And I thought, that's what I want to be, because it meant the study of the mind. And at that time, as I say in the book, I felt there was something wrong with my family. And so I wanted to study something that would help me understand what was wrong. By the time I discovered Primal Therapy, I was 20 years old, and I had discovered myself having difficulty doing that very thing. I'd gotten a scholarship to college. I went to college for 2 weeks and decided I just can't do this. I have to leave, and I left. And I fortuitously happened to be in a library in the week that the book, The Primal Scream, came out. And I started reading it and thought, okay, this is something that will help me be able to do what it is I really want to do. So, and to deal with the things that I felt were wrong in my family. So it was a fortuitous moment. I found the book, and I read it straight through overnight, and woke up the next morning and called the Primal Institute and said I wanted to come there. So
right. And I mean, for people reading that book, I mean, it describes a pretty intense process, right? Where you're going to be doing a lot of crying and a lot of potentially some screaming. And, what on earth had you think, okay, this is a good idea, this is something I want to do? Because I'm imagining the vast majority of people are not going to want to go there. Why do you think you went?
Well, you know what? I think the vast majority of people do not want to go there, and that's fine. If you don't have to go there, most people will not. But I felt that I had to go there because I was aware of my intelligence and my capacity, but I felt myself to be completely stymied and not able to use those qualities that I felt that I had. And also coupling that with a crippling doubt about my abilities. So on the one hand, I was very aware that, yes, this is something that I can do. And on the other hand, of course, you absolutely cannot do that. So I was, betwixt and between. And again, many people would choose not to do such a thing. But when you're pressed, when you're completely frustrated, when you can't see a way out, then yes, that becomes something that you're willing to try to do. At least that's what happened to me.
Yeah. So you felt like you had all these abilities, but you felt crippled somehow.
Exactly. It's as if you were standing against a wall of a building and pushing it with all your might, and the building was not going anywhere.
Right. And so take us through that first experience then, and what that process feel like when you first entered what was the Primal Institute. How does that go for somebody who is invited to go on this journey, and you in this case?
Well, the way it happened for me was I was living on the East Coast of the United States, and the Primal Institute is in Los Angeles, California. So I got on a plane, and on the flight to Los Angeles, I had a panic attack. You're saying, why do people do that? Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. Why am I doing this? I don't know anyone in Los Angeles. I have no idea where I'm going to live, where I'm going to stay. I've never been in a hotel. I don't even know how to register in a hotel. I don't know where I'm going. The institute had recommended a hotel near the institute that I could, where I could stay, and I eventually took a taxi. But I remember the moment on the plane, thinking, if I could turn this plane around right now, I would do that and go back to what was incredibly unbearable for me before, because the unknown was terrifying. So I landed there. I went to the hotel. I paced around in my room. I, cried. And in the intensive, you're in what we called isolation. You're not meant to be making phone calls. You're not meant to be watching television. You're not meant to be reading. You're not meant to be going out to walk around and, see the sights of Los Angeles. You're not meant to be drinking coffee, and you're not meant to be overeating. Those are all the things that I can remember right now. So basically, I was sitting in a strange place, not knowing a single person, and waiting for the morning to come so that I could go and start having my therapy. So it was basically terrifying.
Right. Yes. And for those people who are unaware, this idea of the intensive is when anybody starts primal therapy, they have this period where they're doing therapy every day, and there's certain rules about how you can behave outside of your session.
And the whole point of that is, the way I say to people now, it's not meant to be a punishment, and it's not meant to be a horrible experience for you. What it's really meant to do is strip away all the distractions that most of us use to not pay attention to what's happening inside us. You have a horrible day at work, you have a fight with your boss, you come home, you have a glass of wine, you start watching television. If you're a smoker, you smoke. If you're a runner, you go and run 10 miles. All that, stop. And then what you're left with, it's what's happening inside you.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, I went through that myself, and it's pretty unbearable. And I was kind of kicking off all of that. Why all these bloody rules, and why do we have to do this? And but yeah, it's there for a purpose.
And I actually think at this point, and what I will sometimes say to new people, you can actually consider it a luxury, because when else in your life is it what's asked of you is to totally pay attention only to yourself and how you are feeling, as opposed to the things you have to do, your responsibilities, what other people need from you. All of that is gone. It's just you and how you're feeling. Yeah. And are you sad? Do you keep thinking about, your grandmother or, the mean teacher you had in the third grade? Well, that's something you're going to get to talk about when you come to therapy that next day.
Right. Yeah. And so what did you start to talk about then as you started to have your session?
Well, the way I've laid it out in the book, I really began to talk about my childhood. The therapist, one of the first things that my therapist asked me is, how are you feeling? And, well, all those things that I said before, really scared, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And that's exactly what I responded with. And, it was difficult because, first off, I was quite young. I mean, looking back through the years, I was, 20 years old and had not really had that much life experience. And so my childhood and the things that had happened to me, my early upbringing, my experiences within my family and at school, they were very close for me. They were, it was, it's not like someone coming to therapy for the first time when they're 60 years old. All that childhood stuff is pretty far in the distance, but for me, it was still relatively close. So I began talking about my childhood, what it was like growing up in my family, what it was like having, a father who was extremely volatile and very intense and quite violent. So that's basically where I started.
Right. And was this the first time you'd talked about this?
It was the first time I had talked about it with someone other than a person in my family, basically one of my brothers or sisters. So it was my first go at therapy. And no, I really had not talked about it with anyone. So,
Right. But I guess had you been able to talk openly, let's say, for example, your father, had you been able to talk about him as sort of as an abusive figure and how it impacted you?
well, it's an interesting question. Yes, I had talked about it, but okay, remember being 18 or 19 years old and you're hanging around with your friends. You're not going to say, my father absolutely terrified me and he was really volatile. At any moment, he could hit you for something that seemed relatively minor to you. That's not how most 18 or 19, 16, 17 talk about their families, because normally everyone is pretending that everything is okay. So I didn't want to be the only one who's saying, oh, it's really nice for you, but it's not so nice at my house. So I would talk about it, but in my family, one of the things that we use a lot is humor. So it would always be in a kind of joking way, or not really with the serious import of what it really meant. So I had mentioned it, let's say, but what happens in therapy is you don't just mention it. You don't just say, oh, my father was very volatile. Well, the therapist is not going to let that pass. They're not going to go, oh yeah. So then what? No, they're going to say, so what do you mean? What do you mean volatile? And they're going to wait.
Yeah.
And then perhaps you might say, well, he lost his temper very easily. The therapist might say something like, and then what would happen when he lost his temper? And all that while they're asking those questions, you're kind of dropping down into what really happened. You're not using all those social conventions of, sliding away from what it is or making a joke about it or saying things like, oh, I'm sure it was much harder for other people. And if you do say things like that, the therapist will say, well, really, it's not about other people right now.
Yeah.
What's it like for you? What was it like for you? And you kind of start descending that staircase into what your true experience was and is. So,
And it's true in the sense of because you could describe something in a way that's factually accurate, and in that sense it could be true, but we're talking about a different truth here, right?
well, what I sometimes have said is they're telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Or Carl Jung said in one of his books, people come into my office and they lie and they lie and they lie. And then finally they tell the truth. And often, from my perspective, often the lie that the person is telling is the lie that they tell themselves. They were doing it for my own good. Or, sometimes what my father would say, which is ludicrous actually, when he would be hitting us, this hurts me more than it hurts you. And my brothers and sisters and I would say, well, then why don't you hit yourself then? Not to him, but later we'd talk to ourselves and go, well, fine, go ahead and hit yourself. So, yes, people will tell, usually the facts, just the facts, ma'am. And it's the job of the therapist, hopefully, to get into what the facts really mean and what the facts really feel like. So,
yeah. Then the feel like being, I suppose the operative phrase there, because, well, certainly it was my experience. I just couldn't feel anything, and to begin with.
Yeah, and I talk about that in my book. I mean, sometimes people come to therapy experiencing themselves as having too many emotions or a lot of emotions, or being, getting angry very easily or crying very easily. And then some other people, what they experience is they know they maybe used to have feelings about something, but now it's just flat. And it takes some doing to kind of gently open that flatness and find out what's happening beneath that layer of not being moved by things, or not being moved by your own plight, by what happened to you or what it is that you're experiencing.
Right. And so what was the truth that you started to uncover that moved you as you descended, right? What started to emerge?
Um, One of the things that I think most people eventually come to when they're working on themselves in this format, and I think many children experience this, and I think many adults and many parents forget about this once they become adults, and it's the feeling that you're not loved. Because when your parent loses their temper and yells at you and tells you you're stupid, or you do everything wrong, or I told you once, I told you whatever the parent says, but with that intensity of anger and aggression, the child feels not loved. And when we're young, that is our whole, you know, point of being, to be loved and to love the other, to love our parents. We love them. We want to love them. And so to not be loved, or to have that experience of not being loved, is really very, very painful and very difficult to bear. And I think most people, as they kind of grow into adulthood, they try to have that not be important, because it's hopeless. You're not getting it anyway.
Right. So there's a different quality there, isn't it? To talk about the facts that you were hit by your father and you were abused by your father. That's one level of truth.
Right.
But to be in, I wasn't loved, I didn't feel loved.
Right.
And the pain of that is a much deeper truth.
Exactly. And to go to that deeper truth, it's not just, what will I call it, skillful means by the therapist. It's the development of the relationship between the therapist and the patient, so that as a patient, you are willing, or at least able, to trust that person enough to tell them your most vulnerable secret, or your vulnerable secrets. Maybe the vulnerable secret is, nobody loved me. And I was thinking about this morning. Sometimes people have the experience when they're going into a feeling like, let's say, that nobody loves me. Their logical, factual mind comes in and will say something like, well, of course that's not true. This person loved you and that person loved you. And that can totally derail the feeling. But in a particular moment, when someone is being harsh with you, or they've forgotten you, they've left you standing waiting for them to be picked up from school, and nobody turns up, the feeling in that moment might very well be, nobody loves me. And that's the truth of that moment. Maybe an hour from now, that might not be the very, very truth, but that's exactly what the person is feeling at that time. And that's where we go in therapy. We try to go to those spots where a feeling is the truth for them at that moment, and to be able to listen to that inner truth and not deny it.
Yeah. And, we were talking about before the show. I mean, I had a conversation with a friend of mine once, and I was talking about the fact, I was doing therapy, and I asked her, if you had considered it, because I know that she had quite a distant relationship with her father. And she used the metaphor of a Chinese doll, right? So the way she described it was, her fear of doing therapy was, well, what if I open up one of the dolls? I'm going to find another doll. There's going to be some more underneath that. And then there'll be another doll to open, and then another doll. And when will it ever end? So I suppose there may be people listening to this and thinking, God, yeah, but if I go there and then I come, where's the end of this tunnel? I mean, do I just carry on feeling pain forever? And what's the benefit on the other side of it, even if I do?
Well, I don't believe that there's necessarily a pure benefit to feeling pain all the time. From my perspective, that's not the point. The point of feeling the pain when you need to, when it is stopping you, when it is causing you to do things or not do things that you really want and need to do, then you feel that pain so you have the freedom to make a choice. Because often when we're driven by our pain, we really don't have a choice. Sometimes we think we do. A person who has a problem with alcohol, they think they have a choice about whether they're going to have a drink or 2 drinks or 3 drinks or 4 drinks or 5 drinks. But really, when you get down to it, they don't. Once they start, they don't have a choice. So the nesting doll metaphor or analogy, there's a certain truth to that, because I actually believe that the possibility of our human growth, since this is being human, is that we continue to grow through the course of our lives. All of that growth, all of that opening of the nesting doll will not be in therapy. But yes, you might go through 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 layers of that doll. But that doesn't mean that you get to the end and, okay, now I'm fully cooked and there's nothing more for me to learn and I'm not going to grow anymore. And it's just great exactly the way it is. That's really a false sense of what it is. So there's a certain truth to it that when you open up, let's say, the issue of the very scary father, and you do a lot of work around that, as you go maybe deeper, then maybe the next thing you come on is, well, what about my mother? Why was she standing there letting this happen? Then there's the whole thing of the mother. And then maybe there's school, and there's relationship with your brothers and sisters. Yes, so there are multiple layers of the work that might be done. But for most people, there comes a point where, I haven't traversed every single possible feeling that a human being can work on, but I am in a pretty stable, steady place. I can cry when I need to. I can do the things I want and need to do. I can have a deep relationship with someone if I so choose. I can do the work that I want to do. I can be good with my children. Okay, I'm going to stop now and live my life. And that's often what people do. They get to a spot where they're not thrown about by their feelings. They're not driven by pain or anger or aggression. And they're going to go live their lives. And sometimes things come up again, maybe 10 years, 15 years down the line, they come across something that they want to work on again for a while. And people do come back to therapy and work for a period of time, 6 months or a year, and then they go off and live their lives. So that's my answer to your friend with the nesting dolls. Do you think that would suffice for her?
Well, I think what's interesting is the way you described it is that it's almost as if you could say, well, that's true. Mm-hmm. And as you deal with another of these dolls, you said more choice opens up. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what's on the other side. And that's certainly been my experience. What choices started opening up for you? So you said you came into this position where you felt like you had all these capabilities, and yet you also felt stymied. What choices opened up to you as you started to work on, let's say, on your father, or the issues around your father?
Well, in a certain way, I don't want this to be all about me, but one of the main drivers for me in entering therapy was that I wanted to be able to go to school. I wanted to, get a degree, complete my degrees, begin to do working with people on the human mind, on being human, to, take the name of your show. And that is what I was able to do. I, shortly after, not too long after I was in therapy, I went back to college. I got my degree, got my bachelor's degree, got my master's degree, went into training at the Institute, became a therapist. That was part of what happened to me. And I would say that for many people, they often sometimes people will change careers. If they grew up in a family that, everyone's supposed to be a dentist, and, they're going to dental school and they're working very hard at that. And then, kind of on the side, maybe they're a painter or they're a pianist, and that's truly been their passion. They might choose that, yes, my family wants me to be a dentist and it's a very safe and secure profession and I will always make the money that I need, but I really want to be a painter. And sometimes people make that choice that no, they're not going to complete their dental studies. They're going to, go to Art Institute of Chicago, and they're going to make that be the thing that they do. Or sometimes people continue in that career and they also do the other thing. They don't, maybe before they felt their choice was either or. Sometimes it becomes and. Yes, I'm really fascinated by dentistry or surgery or being a lawyer, but I'm also really moved by writing or painting, and the choice opens up. Perhaps they can do both, or maybe even a third thing as well. So that was what opened for me, and that's what opens for many people.
Right. Now, of course, I completely agree with everything you're saying, and that's absolutely been my experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think there are a lot of people out there who have a very negative view of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
They consider it, maybe it's self-indulgent, it's navel-gazing, it's ultimately a bit of a waste of time. You hear it, I never really got anywhere with it. It's something I hear quite a lot of for people who've been through a therapeutic process. And I think there is a major distinction between the type of therapy which is analytical, that has you perhaps look at your childhood to some extent, but only really as a means to understanding your current thought patterns and behaviors, and is about encouraging you to think new thoughts and behave in new ways, versus this primal therapy or deep feeling therapy or regression therapy, sometimes it's called, where you're doing something quite different. I wonder if you could elaborate on the differences between these styles of therapy and what it means for people.
Well, an analogy that I use in my book is the analogy of if you are walking through a forest and you are bitten by a poisonous snake, and you go someplace for help and you are able to say yes that you were bitten, you're perhaps able to identify the snake that bit you. You're able to, with maybe perhaps this other person, understand what the effects of the poison of this snake might be. Those three things aren't going to do you any good if you've been bitten by a snake. What you need to do in addition, because you do need that information and you do need that analytical process, but what you also need is an antidote to the poison. You need something that's going to stop the effect of that poison and reverse the poisonous trend that is happening in your body. If you've been bitten by a rattlesnake, those are endemic here to the United States, or in Central America, they're coral snakes that, within an hour of you being bitten, your leg could be twice the size that it was before. So fully understanding what happened without taking appropriate action is not, you're going to die. So that's my response to the point of view of therapy is only about understanding. I mean, and there are people that getting that understanding is enough for them. Once they have that understanding or get a sense that, no, it wasn't really all about me, it was the situation that I was in, that can be very helpful. That can help the person begin to move forward. But my point of view is that for extremely severe trauma, fully understanding what happened will not do you that much good, because the trauma still acts upon your body. It's like a person who's, like those soldiers who go to war and have post-traumatic stress disorder. They understand very well that, yes, I was in a war zone for a year, and every move I made, somebody might be trying to kill me. And half of the people that I knew died. Their car was blown up. They know that very well, but they could be walking down the street in London and hear a loud noise, and the next thing they know, they're on the ground trying to get under a car. Understanding is not going to stop their body from doing that. So it's that dichotomy. I think I keep doing this because it's the two hands. You need the understanding and the insight, and sometimes because of how your body has been traumatized, you need the experience of being able to release that trauma through feeling. So I don't think it's one or the other, because primal therapy / deep feeling therapy is not only about, crying your eyes out 24/7 or even every day or once a week. That won't do you any good either. If all you do is cry and cry and cry and cry and you don't have any understanding or insight, you need both of them together. So
right. Yeah, it's the both. And I sometimes read, in fact, I read a book recently that somebody who was characterizing primal therapy as just being just about emoting, and it's just catharsis. And if it were that, I would agree that it has limited value. But of course, you have to marry that with the insight and the understanding of what it means for your life. And so,
well, and let's just say in a typical session, you and I were talking at the beginning about, some things a therapist might say to help you start moving more closely into your feelings. Well, once the person has had their feeling and they're finished crying or being angry or whatever the emotion was, and they've blown their nose and they're back talking the way you and I are talking, then they talk about what that feeling meant, what occurs to them that it's connected to. Oh, now I understand why I always or I never, or why it upsets me when la 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 happens. So that's the insight part of it. And then once you have the insight, it's how you go about changing your life.
Right. And it's been my experience. If I just have some kind of emotional release, but it's not really connected to some event, or it's not clearly connected to a past event or something I experienced, then it is just catharsis, and I can't really make much sense of it. And of course, a skilled therapist works with you to make sure that it's rooted in something. It's
rooted in your own experience, and that the connection between your mind and your body is rejoined, because there often is a kind of discordance, like what your mind is saying and what your body is experiencing. If maybe this never happened to you, but many young children have the experience of waking up in the night and being afraid that something's under their bed. And it really doesn't help you if your parent comes in and says, "Oh, don't be silly, there's nothing under your bed," and leaves the room. That really doesn't make you feel any better. But if your parent comes in and they enter into your emotion, "Oh, that sounds like maybe it was really scary. Let me check." They get down on the floor and they look under the bed. I've checked. There's nothing under the bed now, and I'll stay here with you for a while till you go back to sleep. That helps. But just being told it's silly, it's pointless, don't bother with that, that doesn't help you.
Yeah. And
same thing with, that kind of dichotomy between what are fully rational and in total agreement with our parents, part of our mind is saying to us, while the other, our body and our experiences is saying something totally different.
Right. Yeah. I think that's such an important point. And I remember when I started doing my intensive, all I could say was, "I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." And therapists would be asking me every day, "How are you feeling? How are you feeling? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about it?" "I'm fine. It was fine. It was fine." And he would just keep saying, "What do you mean by fine?" And I just told you I'm okay. And eventually, after like 3 weeks, I started to be able to name a few feelings. Yeah.
Well, what that reminds me of is in my one of my first sessions, my therapist asked me, "So how are you doing?" And I said, "I'm fine." And my therapist said, "Are you really fine, or are you socially fine? Are you really fine?" And I stopped for a moment, and actually, I wasn't really fine. I was socially fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the difference. So your mind, that's discordant, right? When you
Exactly.
say you're fine, and yet you you've got all kind of feelings going on in your body, which I wasn't even aware of to begin with, right? I wasn't aware of my own discordance. I mean, that was the first thing that sort of had to be revealed to me, really.
Well, you had totally been socialized to be fine and to not be a problem, or to not need someone to be there with you and help you work through the places where you were not fine. And then in the course of therapy, you discover that, okay, you can be socially fine. You can go out there and do your job, but in the privacy of your therapy session or in your own home, you really can pay attention to what it is you're most deeply experiencing.
Right. Yeah. And I think, we talked about, who is this for? And I think it's right that it's for people it's who have been deeply traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, reflect on a lot of people who we talked about being driven,
Mm-hmm.
who are driven to drink alcohol, but maybe not in a really extreme way. That they're driven to continually overreact in particular circumstances or underreact in other circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And they spend a lot of energy in investing in strategies to manage these behaviors that they're not comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Or hide them.
Yeah.
Or pretend that there's something else going on than really what is happening.
Yeah. And it's all, yeah. And for those people, if they were to descend into the feelings that are driving even those, I suppose, relatively innocuous and, addictions or compulsions, they'd experience this enormous benefit in their lives. I think, but it seems that only those who are the most hurt, right, find their way to this therapy, or some combination of level of hurt.
That was
and
very true in the very, very beginning. But I've, over the years worked with people that, their childhood was not necessarily violent. They weren't physically traumatized. They were not abused. But there's also the trauma of neglect.
Yeah.
There are people who grow up in families that every physical thing that you could possibly want is there. You have beautiful home, food is always available, clothing is lovely. Then maybe your parents are those driven people that are working 12 hours a day, and they don't have time for you. They're busy important people. That's a trauma. It's a slow moving trauma, and it's actually can be somewhat difficult for a person going into therapy to articulate to themselves or to the therapist, because on the surface everything looks so good. It looks good on paper, it looks good on video, but it just doesn't feel good.
Right. Yeah.
But,
I mean, in fact, I saw some research that go on.
I'm sorry, you asked me a question a moment ago, and I don't think I fully addressed it. What was the question that you asked me? Oh, darn. It went out of my head. You were asking about therapy. No, wasn't the question about who? What was your question just before who would therapy benefit? Can you remember? Because we got sidetracked. Yeah, it'll
come back. But I was just going to add that I remember reading some research a while back about how the children of executives, senior executives, there is a higher incidence of addiction with the children of senior executives, and that's usually because senior executives are working very long hours and tend to not have a lot of time for their kids. And even though they may grow up in great material privilege, they may be,
they don't get that personal interaction with their parents. And often those very high level executives, they're getting paid sometimes millions of dollars, and those millions of dollars require them to be available to their job nearly all of the time. So that person is basically married to their job, and their job is their child as well. And their actual physical child is getting short shrift, though their physical needs are being well taken care of.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, and I also, was reflecting on the fact that how, and this is where it sort of ties in these two threads within this podcast, is the sort of trauma recovery and therapy on one hand, and workplace culture, is that workplace culture can also have an impact in the home, right? If I'm treated like an automaton in my job, I'm atomized, I'm tied down in terms of how I behave each day. Some of that's going to come back into the workplace, right? I can't expect, on the one hand, expect to be this good soldier, this good robot in the workplace 9 to 5, and then come home and be this sort of empathetic, creative, expressive, tuned in parent for my children. I mean, that's pretty unrealistic to expect I can make that shift,
Exactly.
On the commute home. And so I also think there's this spillover of workplace culture into the family, which can also be traumatizing for kids.
Well, definitely so. And, from my own experience, my father was in the military. So that there was a definite spillover, the instant obedience, the toughness, I just remember the question that you asked me. You said you were saying that there's a suspicion about therapy, that there's people have, why would you want to do that? Or there's a question of, what is it about therapy? Why do people have these suspicions? And one of the things I was going to say is that's actually very English. In England, there is a very great deal of suspicion and disparagement of therapy. Why would you want to do that? And there's a certain part of America with another group of Americans who are very, very gung-ho about therapy and working on yourself and being human and growing and becoming more of who you actually are. And I think a lot of the suspicion about therapy has to do with our culture, with our work culture, that you're meant to be doing your job, that you're meant to be tough, that you're meant to be taking care of business, and that you're meant to not need anything. And therapy implies all of those things are not true, that you do need something, that you are vulnerable. And in order for therapy to really work, you need to allow yourself to become vulnerable with another person. It requires you to trust another person very deeply, which most of our culture is all about not doing that. So to me, that kind of explains the suspicion and the reluctance to enter into therapy, because it's frightening. It can be frightening to allow yourself to be vulnerable and to begin to try to trust another person. And you mentioned that you have some friends who have said about therapy, well, it really didn't do very much for me. And my thought would be either the form of therapy was not one that was really aligned with who they are, or the therapist was not the correct therapist for them. What I advise people to do, if you have the opportunity, is to interview several therapists. Go and talk to them, have a session with them, and see if you feel that there's a match. That you, even though you don't trust them yet because you don't really know them, that you'd be willing to try to trust that person. And if you're not, if you have a weird feeling about them, if you're like, I don't think I want to tell them all of my secrets, then that probably isn't a good connection for you. They may be a great therapist, but they might not be a good compatible mix for you. So,
right. Yeah, and that's one of the things you talk about in the book in terms of the difference between deep feeling therapy and primal therapy, at least, how it's often practiced. And that is, it's almost like the therapist doesn't really matter, right? As long as they're following the process, that's what's important. And actually, you make the point that actually developing a relationship between the therapist and the patient is very important.
Well, because I think for most people that come into therapy that grew up in difficult circumstances, and the difficulties may be very different, as we were talking about, abusive, violent, volatile situations, or in the lap of luxury, but without the deep parental connection. Once that person is an adult, they basically don't trust people. They can be friendly, they can appear nice, but at their core, they're not willing. They do not trust other people. and it takes a lot for them to trust another human being. And that is, it's like the basic trust has been broken somehow in their childhood. And again, from my perspective, the basis of therapy is rebuilding that trust, starting with the therapist, hopefully, and then moving on to other people in your present life. Take that risk of telling someone the truth, perhaps that they upset you or that they hurt your feelings, that something they said didn't feel very funny to you, but it made you feel bad. That's vulnerable. You have to trust the person to say that to them.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the thing I certainly came into therapy not really trusting anybody.
Yeah.
But as you say, I'd use my brain to develop social skills.
Right. And you knew how to move through a social situation. Yeah. But again, when someone in your early therapy said, "So how are you?" you were fine. That was the socially skilled answer, and the non-trusting answer. Because,
right. A very good point, right? Right. Very good point. Yeah.
And as you said, by near the end of your therapy, your 3-week, your intensive, you were able to say something other than fine about how you were.
And it was actually because the therapist suggested I go watch a movie, and I watched this particular movie about a breakup, and I'd experienced a breakup not that long before entering therapy, and I cried for the first time in maybe 5 years or something, and I came in the next day, and I think that was the first time I'd able to say, "No, I'm not fine. I felt sad watching this movie last night." And then it started from there, and then I cried again. So that was twice in 24 hours, which was extraordinary for me at that point. And that sort of I suppose that was a firing gun on
there. Yes,
15 years of crying. Most days.
What was the movie?
It was The Notebook. Yeah. And so that's that was my.
That was your gateway.
That was my gateway into it, and absolutely that the girl that I spoke to and talked about the Chinese dolls and nested dolls, completely correct. That it has just been sort of one feeling after another, and you resolve something, and then something else is able to emerge, and new themes are constantly emerging. Have been over this period. I see the metaphor more like waves, right? And sometimes I've had really stormy days, and sometimes it's been calm, and so these feelings come in waves. But ultimately, more and more choices opened up, and I've become more and more connected.
And the other thing is that in working your way through each one of those dolls, you regain aspects of yourself that had been shut away from you. So when you go to that next doll, there's more of you available to deal with whatever that doll contains for you. And you, rather than feeling, and I think some people have a very strong fear that they're going to feel weaker and incredibly vulnerable, that they break down sobbing every day in the grocery store when they're trying to buy a quart of milk. That's actually not what happens. There's more of you available to handle the things that come up for you in a way that you did not have before. That's mostly my experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I'd say two things. I mean, one is, I think we sort of retain this switch, or at least I have, that I can just turn off the tap. I can say, okay, I need to go back into socially functioning mode now, and I can live my life. But also, I think what I've found is I will burst into tears on the train, or I will burst into tears in driving home, because stuff's just coming up, and there's a part of my body that doesn't want to keep it down anymore, and will take any opportunity to let it out.
And because the development of your capacity for trust, means that you have the strength and the capacity to be able to cry on the train. Because if something happens, you trust yourself that you know that if suddenly there's, a weird person on the train and you need to take some action, you're going to stop crying and take care of it. You're going to
Yeah.
do what you need to do. You have that internal trust in your capacity to deal with a difficult circumstance. So it's not a total loss of your sense of ability to deal with things as they happen. Sometimes people early in their therapy would ask me that question. Well, am I going to just become a puddle of water on the floor all the time? I said, you could be in the middle of the deepest feeling of your life. And if there was suddenly a fire in the building, you would know how to get up from crying and get out of that building because you have that capacity. As you said, to turn it off if need be. You could be feeling, you could be crying your eyes out, and someone next to you on the train has a heart attack. You would stop crying and you would start trying to help them. It's not that controls you. It's a capacity that you have that you can allow.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing you said that I think is right. You get more of you, and that's not just metaphorically. I literally can have a great sense of my body. Like, I know this is going to, but a lot of the tension I held from my stories with a birth trauma, right, where I sort of frozen and couldn't get out, and literally, I've developed a greater sense within myself of parts of the backs of my legs, of my chest. So I feel more of myself at a very much a bodily level, as well as the sort of the other sense in which I've got more of my sort of emotional self to express from. So yeah.
Well, and it's hard to, let's say, trust your body and trust your capacity when, because of whatever your life circumstance has been, you're not really living in your body. I used to say, living from the eyebrows up, and your body's just something to move that around. And then when your entire sense of yourself permeates your whole body, you discover that you have capacities that you really didn't even know were there. So
right, exactly, capacities, and I was really clumsy. I was diagnosed with dyspraxia when I was a kid, with the clumsy child syndrome, and I don't really relate to myself as clumsy anymore. And I think that's simply because I'm just more aware of where my body parts are and how I am in space. Yeah, I'm living in my body. And so I think that is a very, that's so we talked about choice being one of the benefits of taking this deep dive in. It's also becoming more embodied, having this greater sense of myself, who I am physically and emotionally.
And another thing that I view as one of the really great benefits of therapy is that often, because of whatever happened in our childhood as we were growing up, in our young years in school, as we get older, we lose a sense of compassion for ourselves, for our own suffering. And in doing that, we lose it for other people as well. It gets muted. It's not that we become like a narcissistic monster, but you're just kind of closed down. But as you begin to experience your own pain, your own sadness, your own anger, you're emotionally more free and more available to yourself. And so you can have a greater sense of compassion for perhaps your children, if you have children, or someone that you're close to who's going through a difficult time. If we're shut off from our feelings, let's say if a coworker has a great tragedy, sometimes people will say that when they've gone through a great tragedy, their friends or their coworkers avoid them. They kind of distance from them. And why do they do that? Because they don't know what to do.
Right.
But when you're more in touch with yourself, you maybe have a greater understanding that it's not that you're going to do anything that's going to make it all better for that person, but you can be there with them for a moment. Whether it is that you put your arm around their shoulder or you just are there with them and say how sorry you are that it happened, whatever it is, as opposed to, oh, hi, and off you go, because you don't know what to do with yourself when someone is suffering. But when you've encountered your own suffering, you're willing to be there for a moment with another person, another human being.
Yeah, so I've found that I mean, I used to be completely paralyzed. I mean, I remember early in my relationship with my current partner, she fell on a ski trip. You know, she sort of lost her footing, and she was sort of in a bit of a pile on the floor, and her female friends came to comfort her, and I just sort of stood there like, well, I don't know, like, do I, you know, just throw literally no clue how to deal with somebody who I cared for and was upset, right?
Right.
And she was quite angry with me after, you know, why didn't you come and comfort me? You know, and that's something I've definitely grown in my capacity to kind of tune in. I mean, others will be the judge of this, of course, but I believe I've developed a greater capacity for compassion, but also love, like with my kids, because I've been active in therapy, like my kids are now 3. And I've seen over the period of that 3 years, even out of, you know, 15 years doing that my ability to just feel like in the moment, God, I love you, you know, to my child is definitely increased over the period I've been working on myself.
Exactly. You know, the ability to be in touch not just with your sad emotions or your painful emotions or your therapeutic emotions, but in dealing with those, it's kind of it's paradoxical. And by going into those, your capacity for the joyous, loving, happy, connected emotions also that becomes more available to you. I mean, in varying degrees, we all have it, but when we're having to close down and shut down a great deal of painful emotion, then it's not a very discriminating volume control. When you turn down the volume on those negative emotions,
that's right.
The positive emotions get turned down as well. So
yeah. And I think I had two, you know, and I reflect on this, and I kind of had 2 modes before therapy. It was either shut down or high, right? Or, you know, drunk or high. You know, it was, that was the 2 feeling states. It was shut down or some kind of outer body high, right? But yeah, that's the difference, is you become less shut down. You experience a lot more pain and a lot more joy, and you have less need to feel high. You know, that's
right.
That's how I see it. And, you know, we talked about workplace culture before, and this is something that I think is starting to see a little bit of creeping in to culture now, is like this acceptance that we, for example, might start a meeting with a check-in, right? Like, how are people feeling? Right? What's going on? Like, so this is something I'm noticing. What do you, because there's the kind of therapy that happens between a therapist and a patient, you know, in a treatment room or in a, you know, wherever it happens. And then there's the sort of, I suppose, this broader idea of us becoming more comfortable with feelings in society in general. What do you think about that?
I think there is a greater acceptance, but there's still very much a workplace, I would say, workplace culture and what is acceptable that is very different than, let's say, being in therapy or even being with your very close intimates. But it's not, there has been a change, and I think part of the change has to do with growth of awareness in our society. But I also wonder if it has to do with there being more women in the workplace, and women in the workplace having higher level positions, in that when all the leadership positions are men, there's a certain man culture, you know, being tough, being very stiff, not admitting any vulnerability. And that is starting to, I won't say soften, but it's starting to open up. And I believe that women have an effect on that. And I believe the movement of therapy and growth and development, our development of our human capacities, is percolating through our culture. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things. And I also think it has a lot to do with the younger people. You know, of course, here in the United States, there's the very intense emotional experience that many African American people are having around George Floyd murders and the many that have been in the news over this last very short period of time, and that very intense experience of the emotions of grief and rage and sadness and protest, and that young people, black and white, all cultures, are coming together to protest against this systemic aggression against young people, brown people, black people, immigrants. And I believe that has percolated down, especially into the young people, so that they can have that compassion for someone other than themselves. I believe that's a very great benefit of the human potential movement, the growth of awareness of feelings, emotions, depth of human experience. That's kind of my belief.
Right. But I guess, so that's an interesting one to reflect on, because of course, because yes, certainly it seems like, we have this great, I suppose, outpouring of emotion, particularly, around, the context you've just described. But is that, but there is a difference, right, between kind of getting angry at the man and descending into our own feelings and the anger that we may have had around our early childhood experiences. And see, I see, because can it sometimes actually be a bit of an act out to externalize this and get angry, with the system, that may be a defense against feeling
absolutely
something.
It can be
inside.
A defense, but it's also a defense for someone to, or it's a response to earlier trauma, that a person becomes paralyzed and they don't do anything. They have those very intense emotions, but they're not expressing them in any way, or the emotions are so intense that they completely shut down. So the capacity to express, and it is not necessarily always anger and aggression. Sometimes it's compassion for the people that have suffered. Sometimes it's solidarity with people that are being badly treated. So yes, anything that we humans can do can be an act out. I mean, we can transmute anything that we do into something that is a protectant against what's happening internally. But I remember early on in my therapy, some people were concerned that, okay, if I work my way through my feelings and I go deep, deep inside, does that mean I'm just going to be a couch potato and sit around and not care about culture and other people? No, it means, or it can mean, that you have maybe greater compassion for other people's suffering, and you might choose to do something about it. But that kind of anger that's only focused outward against the system or the man, that also can be a defense. As I said, anything we do, we can use in a defensive manner.
Yeah, because, and I say that because, that's certainly been my experience. It's I would, there was all kind of people I was angry in my life about. I'm angry this person's got ahead and I haven't, and this person's been given this opportunity and I haven't. And I was never somebody sort of out on the streets protesting, but I definitely had that kind of anger, most of it in my head, right? I mean, I have to say I was never somebody who physically really expressed it, but certainly in my head, and I would sort of drink it away, or, find some way to sort of dissolve it. But that's reduced, massively, right? So over the course of my therapy,
if you were a social activist, you would be much more effective as you are now than you would have been expressing that kind of anger and aggression then, because now you may see that something is wrong. It doesn't necessarily make you furious or make you angry, but it might help you be able to see how to take effective action, or how you can truly be helpful in the situation in a way that when we're just angry, we can't even see. It doesn't even seem as a possibility. So I think it does not mean that as you work your way through your feelings, you're going to be like, all is peace and love, I don't have to do anything in the world. No, we do things. Let's say if you're walking down the street and you saw someone abusing a child, you wouldn't necessarily run up and start screaming in their face, but you might intervene in some way by saying, can I help you? Is there something that, can I be of help in any way? That's an intervention too. And it might be much more helpful than beginning to yell and shout at that person and tell them that they're abusive, they're doing the wrong thing with their child.
Right. So, and I find that actually with my, my partner, right, is that I can be more present, if she's having a bad day or whatever. In the past time I've reacted to that, sort of fight fire with fire. And now I'm not all the time, but I'm more likely to sort of be able to distance myself a little bit from the anger and say, okay, is there anything I can help with? What can I do right now to help you?
Exactly. And sometimes all she needs is just to vent totally and tell you all about how horrible it was.
Yeah. I think that's right.
And not necessarily meaning that you did something wrong, because, when we've got that, we've been made to feel wrong a lot. If someone tells you something is not okay for them, it can raise the defensive hackles very quickly. Like, I didn't do anything wrong, because we've been made to feel wrong so many times that even if everything is not okay, then it must be our fault and we need to defend against that. So,
I think that's right. But then there's this other thing that emerges. I think it's this ability to be assertive, right? So I can say that's not okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not okay. I'm not going to get, I'm not going to get violently angry about this. This is the trend, right? It's not like I never lose my temper, but the trend is I'm less likely to get sort of really angry about something. But if I sense some kind of injustice and something I'm not uncomfortable with, I'll say that's not okay. No, that's not okay. Right. And that is one of the differences. So it's not like I've become a couch potato and peace and light. Right. Although I'm able to experience more peace and light in my life.
Exactly.
I'm also, becoming more effective at being protective around my own boundaries and what I'm going to accept and not accept.
Yeah, and the whole peace and light thing. Often, sometimes you'll encounter those people that they're able to talk the peace and light game, but if they get pushed, a volcano can erupt very quickly. Yeah. So, it's really being the balance of who you actually are, being able to, at the moment that you first notice that something is not okay, to be able to say then, that's not okay for me, as opposed to you swallow it and you smile and you try to pretend it's okay, and then whoosh, there's a big eruption because it's just built up and gotten more and more intense internally. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just reminded of somebody who was really into her Zen Buddhist, and I spent the day with her. She'd just been meditating for like 3 hours, and she got out of the meditation. I'd met her and we went to the train station, and the train left without her, and she completely exploded in rage.
Wow.
After 3 hours of meditating, so that's a great example of where we sort of, if we put meditation as a sort of medication on top of a lot of anger and hurt, it doesn't really serve us. Which is again a reason why I think it's important that we, as you say, we learn to descend as well as ascend, right? We've got to take the ladder down into
go down the steps into what our deepest experience is. And then when we come back up, we have more of ourselves available. And, often we're able to move through the world in a way that is much more truthful and deep and connected to ourselves, and capacity to connect to other people. That, that's, from my perspective, some of the great benefit of doing therapy.
Yeah. Now I wanted to end on, for those, so there will be some people who may come to this podcast, and because they have an interest in primal therapy. And of course, that's where you started your journey. And now we have deep feeling therapy. And we've touched on one of the differences between the two, and that is this focus on the relationship between therapist and
the
patient.
transference.
The transfer. So explain that a little bit. When you just talked about transference for people who are not familiar with it.
The transference in psychological terms means that when you have a tendency, we humans have a tendency to transfer to other people our feelings and emotions from our childhood. So if you had, an aggressive father and you encounter an authority figure, a policeman, you have a tendency to respond to that policeman as if they were your father. So in the context of therapy, transference is we have the tendency, and basically it happens, we transfer the experiences we had with our parents onto our therapist, and we expect to receive from our therapist what we received from our parents. And it's part of the process of therapy to work your way through that. If you expect that your therapist is going to be angry with you, you behave in a certain way. If you had an angry parent and you expect your therapist is going to be angry, then you behave in certain ways. And it's the process of therapy that you get to talk about and realize, oh, I keep expecting my therapist to be the way my parents were. Or a very strong feeling comes up about your therapist and you work your way into it. And the connection is, oh yeah, that's exactly how my dad was with me or my mom was with me. So in primal therapy, especially in the early days, Dr. Janov maintained that there was no such thing as transference in primal therapy. But I found that to be completely untrue. There was definitely transference, from in my early days as a patient, from me to my therapist, and then as a therapist, from my patients to me. Yeah.
So you acknowledge that, and it's something you manage as part.
And it can be very fruitful. If a person comes in and they say, "Oh, I'm 5 minutes late. I'm sure you're really, really angry with me." Well, it's really not my job to say, "Oh no, I'm not angry. What is it you need to talk about today?" No, I say, "So what makes you so sure I'm angry?" Or tell me about me being very angry with you. What you think's going to happen? What does that mean? We just keep talking about it, and as we talk, the correlations and the resonances start to occur to the person, that they maybe realize, oh, I always expect people to be angry with me. And what about that? And where does that come from? Oh, because there was a very angry household that I grew up in. And, then we go down into what the feeling actually is.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And
that's how.
So that's one aspect: acknowledging, accepting, working with the transference. And what else distinguishes deep feeling therapy from primal therapy?
Well, you mentioned it earlier, and that is that the connection between the therapist and the patient is actually very greatly important. And it's not that therapists or your connection to a therapist, they're like widgets and you can just stick one in and everything will come out as it needs to. It's
follow the protocol and it'll all be fine.
It's on the basis of the depth of the relationship and the transference activities that take place, and working through those transference activities and developing the actual trust in the relationship and the trust in the process of therapy itself, that growth and change takes place. So, transference, the connection with the therapist. In my days, when I was trained at the Institute and worked at the Institute and was the director of the New York Institute, the point of view was that you had your 3-week intensive with a particular therapist. And then after that, you just worked with whoever was available when you came to group. And you did not have ongoing individual therapy sessions after your 3-week intensive. And so I found that to be not as helpful as when I began my own practice, to have the 3-week intensive with me as the therapist and then continue individual work in addition to working in group. That allowed the trust and the development of the relationship between myself and my patients to deepen and grow, and that facilitated the therapy process. And the other basis on which I had a point of disagreement with Dr. Janov, and this was based on his own early training as a psychoanalyst, was that his point of view was that homosexuality was a neurosis, and that neurosis needed to be worked on and dealt with and cured. And as I talk about in my book, I kind of accepted that when I first went into training, but I had a patient that I worked with who was homosexual, and his point of view was that no, this has been my sexual orientation from when I was very young. So this therapy is telling me that everything about me is wrong and that I need to do something to make myself very different than who I am and how I am. And that was a revelation to me. I really had to deeply think about and consider that, and it changed my point of view. It made me see that, again, as I said, anything that we humans do can be neurotic, but there are just as many heterosexual neurotics as there might be homosexual neurotics, and the sexual orientation of heterosexuality or homosexuality is not necessarily neurotic.
Yeah, I think that's the important point, isn't necessarily, because I remember when I read that section of your book, I came to therapy. I mean, I've got a heterosexual orientation, and I've got a partner, I've got kids. But one of the reasons I came to therapy was, I acted out sexually, let's just say outside of that orientation. And that changed, so my that changed over the course of my therapy. So I did experience a shift in my sexuality over the course.
Right.
Well,
people often
therapy.
do, people often, I won't necessarily say that they have a shift in their identification, but in how that's expressed. It's incredibly neurotic if you're heterosexual and you're always in very volatile, dramatic, lots of jealousy and arguments and fights. And that's the kind of relationship you have over and over and over again. That in and of itself is neurotic. Maybe your sexual orientation is not neurotic, but the way you express it is. So that could change dramatically during the course of a person's therapy.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. But what about sort of sexual preferences and proclivities? I mean, have you experienced those shifting for people as a result of doing deep feeling therapy?
Well, I think many, many things shift during the course of therapy. And what people are, often people are trying to work out, let's say the man who's only attracted to women that are not interested in him, that then you have to work very, very hard to get that person to see you and appreciate you and give them gifts and do dramatic things. Well, if we can, we work and we discover what was the relationship with perhaps their mother or an older sister. They had no interest in him. And maybe that person worked very, very hard to attract a little bit of that person's warmth and love. So they're playing that out over and over and over again. Over the course of therapy, the shift would probably be subtle over time, but perhaps eventually they would find someone who was equally interested in them, who, the interest was mutual as opposed to only being strongly attracted to people that didn't find them attractive.
Right.
So, that's just a for instance. But yes, the dynamic of how a person operates in an intimate relationship can undergo very great shifts and very great growth and development. Sometimes people are attracted to someone that they think is going to take care of them. Well, perhaps in the course of therapy, they discovered that they weren't well taken care of as a child. And when they work their way through those feelings, maybe they're not so interested in a person to take care of them. Maybe they are able to consider having an equal partnership with someone. So, yeah. Many, many things change in the course of therapy, as I'm sure you're aware. I mean, I won't say they change, but they grow and they develop as you grow and you develop.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's also true. But I guess the point that I think is worth making is, in a sense, this is a radical form of therapy, right? Because one, goes to the darkest imaginable places in one's history. I have in my history. You sort of stare down, in my case, death, because of my, near-death experience during birth. And this radical approach, in a sense, in that sense, can, at least in my experience, and I believe for others, cause this sort of radical, quite significant, profound shifts in who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes, sexuality. It includes, personality. It includes, beliefs. Fundamental. I've seen big shifts in, some of my, beliefs about interests. So I think that there's this. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say is, where people have experienced major trauma in their lives, it can have had a major shift in who they are. And then doing this major work can lead to this, profound change in who people are.
And that is basically the hope, that it's not just a kind of surface cosmetic growth and development, but that it goes to the very core of one's being. And we often have no idea exactly how that's going to manifest, but to be open to whatever it is. And I think you and I have carried on for quite a long time now.
Yes.
You were saying to kind of, you wanted to end on a particular point.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think, I just wanted for people who were particularly interested in that point, like the difference between primal and deep feeling therapy, I wanted to make sure we covered that.
And my guess is, I haven't, Dr. Janov died not too long ago, so I don't know how he might have, done any development on his own. But at the time that he and I, had the parting of the ways, that was very much a very distinct difference between the two of us. So.
Yeah, and I'd say, in defense of, I've now been with the Primal Center, and I think it has, from what you've described, it's different, right? I've had long-term relationships with my therapists.
Right, exactly.
I'm not sure they're as fundamentalist on the homosexuality question. But I mean, I'm not a therapist, so it's a bit difficult for me to, to fully represent it, from a therapist perspective. But certainly my intuition is, my sense is that, it's changed quite a lot since the primal therapy that you experienced.
Yeah, hopefully therapies develop as well as the people that are doing them, as or as therapists, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Good. All right. Well, thank you so much for sparing the time. Again, for people, this is the book, Facing the Wolf, Inside the Process of Deep Feeling Therapy. And I would recommend it, if you're a therapist and you're interested in this style of therapy, then absolutely it gives, wonderful insight into how this style of therapy works. If you're thinking about taking this route with your own therapy, then this is, a great introduction to how it works. So
thank you so much.
That's the book. Again, thank you for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
For me as well. Bye.